Have you ever tried auto exposure on steroids? Let me show you my favorite camera settings that I use for most of my photography these days and tell you why they are superior in most situations. In photography, there's two challenges. When you're a beginner, you may not really know what settings to choose, and if you're an advanced photographer, you may not always have time enough to change the settings. My first example would be when you photograph birds in the forest. On one branch, there might be easily 4 times as much light available than on another branch where leaves block the light. Or when you photograph playing kids. When you want to get genuine shots and they toy around you, the lighting can change dramatically and you should rather concentrate on composition than on the camera settings. Same with sports. If sprinters cross the finish line and you follow them to get some emotional shots, the light could be totally different. The truth is, the better you get, or better said, the more access you get to higher class sports where TV demands better lighting, the more even the conditions will become, particularly indoors or at night. During daylight, you obviously have no control over the light. And finally, for example, a wedding when the couple steps out of the venue into bright sunlight. There is no way you can change exposure so fast. So these are situations where you cannot use, for example, manual exposure, but you still want full control over your camera settings. So that was part 1 of 3. Why you need the settings I'm going to show you. Part 2 is what you have to set. In my photography course, I told you about the primary camera setting. Either shutter speed if you want to freeze or blur motion, or aperture if a big or shallow focus is more important. What if I told you that you can set both and still make them flexible and automatic at the same time? I personally, most of the time, care more about shutter speed than aperture, as motion blur, if not done intentionally, can and will destroy your shots. So you would assume that I set shutter priority, where I would set the shutter speed and the camera would take care about aperture. But that's not what I do. Even though shutter speed is my priority, I set aperture priority on the mode dial. Yes, I know, that sounds like a very stupid move, but it's in fact a genius move, even though I'm personally not a genius. Next up is ISO, which I will set to auto. If I have full control over both aperture and shutter speed and I set them to what I really need, ISO is the only variable that is left. So setting that to auto is something professionals do way more often than beginners would think. Beginners will think, oh, I can't go above ISO 1600 because at one point the shot will become so noisy, I don't like that. Professionals think, if I have set aperture and shutter speed according to what it takes to take a good shot, my only variable is ISO. So I have 2 options. Either set it as high as needed or go home. I'll rather get the shot than go home. So we have set aperture and ISO, which leaves us with shutter speed. And I hear you say, but Wolf, how can I set shutter speed if I'm in aperture priority? There is a setting in many cameras, not in every camera I have to admit, that would let you set a minimum shutter speed, but only when auto ISO is set. You can't set the exact value, but you can set the minimum value. So let's say I'm photographing birds in flight and don't want to go below 1/2000th of a second. I could do that with a function called ISO auto minimum shutter speed. I could set those 1/2000ths of a second as a minimum and the camera would never go below that. If it needs more light, it would raise ISO instead. On Canon you can find that setting under ISO speed setting, min shutter speed. On Nikon it is ISO sensitivity settings, minimum shutter speed. Just for clarification, ISO doesn't add more light but only adds gain. That's where the noise comes from. So raising ISO should always be your last reserve. But that's what this technique does anyway. Here's 2 things. First, you will probably think, what? I have to go into the menu all the time to do that? And second, wait, you can only set it in full stops? What if I wanted 1/2500th of a second? I have good and bad news. The bad news is that yes, particularly with Sony cameras, you can only set it in full stops. So Sony, if you listen, that's a weird limitation. Please change that, and please Sony, keep listening because I will have another suggestion for you. Because the good news is that you don't always have to go into the menu. You have 2 options. You can either set that function to a custom button, so when you press for example C1, you can get there much faster. And the second option is a little slower, namely set it to your quick menu. And here's my second request to Sony and probably all the other manufacturers. Why not let me set exactly as I would in manual exposure? To clarify, my camera is set up to have shutter speed on the front dial and aperture on the rear dial. If I change to aperture priority, both dials, the front dial and the back dial, will let me set aperture. That's relatively useless because aperture is stored in my muscle memory. I would never use the front dial for it, so it's basically unused. So please, camera manufacturers, let us program the front dial in Aperture Priority to set ISO auto minimum shutter speed. Okay, so much for my try to make photography easy again. Back to why this setting is so powerful. Our exposure is now fully automatic, yet we still have full control over aperture and shutter speed. If that created a knot in your brain, let me clarify with an example. Let's say I photograph long jump. I love to shoot long jump with my 135mm portrait lens with an aperture setting of f1.8. I am in Aperture Priority, so I have full control over aperture by rotating the dial as I would do anyway. I will set f1.8 because I love the background blur that setting would give me. So much for aperture. I need a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second to freeze the motion, so I set ISO auto min shutter speed to 1/2000th of a second. Now the camera will never go below that. Could it go above that? Yes, of course. And when shooting in bright daylight with an aperture of f1.8, that often happens. But that wouldn't have any influence on the image because that would freeze the motion even more. All I want is not to go below 1/2000th of a second. I don't care at all if it goes above that. But what happens if it gets darker? The minimum shutter speed will still be 1/2000th of a second. The camera won't go below that and raise ISO instead. So your camera is now on steroids and takes care about exposure while you can fully concentrate on composition and focus. If you want more tips like that, let me recommend subscribing to my Wolf Letter email list.